All right, so hopefully that video helped to illustrate how with age the children become more sophisticated. Let's talk specifically about the logical thinking that was displayed. First off, I introduced the concept of hypothetical thought before that video, and the idea with hypothetical thought is that it includes propositions and possibilities that may not reflect reality, right? Like when you hold a hypothesis in your mind, it can be true or it can be false, right? And that the reality will help you to determine whether your hypothesis is true or false. So by holding a hypothesis in our mind, we can sort of in the world make tests about the accuracy of that hypothesis and ultimately transform our perceptions as we get feedback from the environment about the accuracy or inaccuracy of our hypothesis. Inductive reasoning is when you reason from one or more specific experiences or facts to a general conclusion. So you have evidence from usually your own personal experience in inductive reasoning, but it could be things that you read about, it could be things that you've been taught or told, but lots of different information that all comes together to help you form a general conclusion. Sometimes we call this bottom-up reasoning because you're using elements that exist or have existed. They might only exist in your memory at this point, but these are things that have happened in the world that you've observed or you've experienced, and you draw a conclusion based on these experiences or facts. That's called inductive reasoning, which is a type of bottom-up reasoning. Deductive reasoning is where you have a general statement, premise, or principle, and then you use logical steps to figure out the specifics about that general statement, premise, or principle. We oftentimes call this top-down reasoning because it's going to rely very heavily on you using your logic to deduce it out. So as we age, we tend to become more and more deductive in our reasoning. We're able to take a general principle and start extending it out to specific cases, for example. So unfortunately, this can fuel stereotyping. For example, if we start to realize in our math class, the kids who have their hands up first, on average, are female, we may start to generate a hypothesis that females are better at math than males. And we may take it from this specific, okay, this was this one kid who I know and she always knows the answer, to then we start to generalize and go, oh, look, that girl also has her hand up. Oh, that girl also has her hand up. And we start to assume that, okay, I'm seeing what the pattern is. I start to deduce that the pattern is that girls are better at math. So we oftentimes can generate stereotypes based on deductive reasoning. So it's not always superior to be deductively reasoning. You can come to incorrect conclusions. You can come to conclusions that actually will in the long run narrow your understanding of the world, right? Because you're like, okay, well now I understand all the specifics. All girls are good at math, right? And then next thing you know, you're expecting all girls that you encounter to be good at math. And this is exactly what we mean by stereotyping or prejudice, right? So it's not always the greatest to be a deductive reasoner. It's just that you use more details and more information when you do deductive reasoning. And so it's a little bit more likely to be accurate. Now, in scientific reasoning, a lot of times we use inductive reasoning a lot because we want to avoid tainting the conclusions too much with our own past experiences and our own, stereotyping or biases. And so we'll oftentimes do the kind of bottom-up processing that is characteristic of inductive reasoning. So we let the data show us what the pattern is rather than us saying, well, I understand the general principle, I'll just tell you what the pattern would be, which would be more deductive reasoning. So it's not always the case that deductive reasoning is superior to inductive. It's just a little bit more advanced and allows us to draw conclusions based on things that we wouldn't necessarily have to then go collect data or something like that to make a reasonable guess in a lot of situations. So let's move on to some of the evidence that we have for what is called adolescent egocentrism. Now, it's really super important that you clear out of your mind the concept of Piaget's preschool egocentrism, because this is a different thing that we're talking about here. Preschool egocentrism completely had to do with, if I can perceive it, everybody can perceive it, kind of mistaken assumptions. With adolescent egocentrism, we really are talking about the kind of egocentrism that you probably think we're talking about, sort of self-centeredness, self-absorption, stuff like that. So, some manifestations of that researchers have noticed. Adolescents suddenly become very eager to find fault with authorities, whether it's their parents or their teachers or law enforcement or the system in general. For the adolescent mind, it's really rewarding to find evidence that let's say an authority who has told us, oh, you shouldn't do this behavior, whatever behavior you want to do. You shouldn't do it. It's harmful or wrong. You shouldn't do it. And then you catch that authority doing the behavior. It's really super rewarding. It feels really like you're a hypocrite is one of the favorite things of the adolescent to say. You're a hypocrite. You told me not to do it and now you're doing it. Or you told me I should do it and you never do it. Finding those kinds of faults. Finding that somebody who you were taught had done good things in history and then to find out that they had failings is very satisfying for the adolescent mind. To be like, see, that person shouldn't even be held up as a role model because they did something wrong. And it could be some big wrong or it could be a very small wrong. It doesn't really matter in the adolescent mind. The idea is just being able to undermine the authority or the person who we've been trained to look up to. Really tied to that is this newfound argumentativeness. Children who had been pretty compliant and, tended to go along with the rules and kind of followed the pack from research to class. From recess to class. And like pretty compliant kids, when they get into adolescence, they start to go, well, no, I didn't. Or you don't own me. Or they start to get argumentative, or they challenge ideas a lot more than they would have when they were younger. And they say, well, how do you know that? Or you don't know you don't know everything. These kinds of argumentative, I'm giving you lots of little phrases that adolescents oftentimes will say when maybe they don't have enough knowledge to really back up their attack, but they want to just make sure that the other person knows that I'm not really buying what you're saying, right? Like, I don't agree with you. And it's really a dramatic change from childhood into adolescence. This switch sort of flips and you have this kid who suddenly wants to argue about a lot of things. Adolescents are a lot more self-conscious than children were. Like, that's one of the ways that you can kind of tell that a kid is moving into puberty is that they become very self-conscious about their body, about how they look, about how they're acting, whether their smile is, like, should I cover up my smile with my hand or laugh? When I laugh, should I cover my mouth with my hand? These kinds of things, these are evidence that the imaginary audience has entered the auditorium. Suddenly, for an adolescent, it seems like everybody's watching them. It's an imaginary audience because in all reality, most adolescents are watching themselves with equal vigor. Of course, there are variations in development, so I guess it's possible that some kids are being watched by the ones who have either completed at puberty or maybe haven't gotten there yet. I guess it's possible that they're being judged and critiqued like that, but probably not to the degree that the child who's experiencing the imaginary audience thinks they are. They really think that if they have a spot on their pants, everyone's going to notice and everyone's going to make fun of them, and they just want to go home so badly and change their clothes because this is awful and I can't be seen like this. I had a friend who just refused to ever go into Kmart because what if somebody saw her in Kmart? And I said, well, wouldn't that mean they were there? And then she goes, well, maybe they would just see me going in. She was like, I didn't want anybody to see me in Kmart. For those of you who don't know what Kmart is, it was a discount department store that I think it's gone out of business now. But she just did not want to be seen in the Kmart because she thought people would see her and judge her, and forgot that anybody who saw her and might be judging her was probably there too. But that's what the imaginary audience does to us. It makes us so self-conscious. And so a lot of times you'll notice, especially with young adolescents, they'll be really awkward with their body movements. They don't know what to do with their hands. They'll cover their mouths when they laugh. They're very just clearly self-conscious. And they think that it's because they think that people are watching them, that people are judging them. I can tell you from a very far distance away from high school, it's really surprising how many things were happening to other people in high school that I had no idea about. Like, even people who I considered to be friends, maybe they were on my same team with me or something. I had no idea about something embarrassing or something like that happened to them. And they're telling me, and they're like, oh, you must remember that this awful thing happened to me. And it's like, I have no recollection of that. And then I'll say, to be part of the conversation, yeah, well, how about this one? Do you remember when this happened to me? And they'll be like, no, I don't remember that happened to you. that kind of shows you that it's not just that one of us was oblivious. It's probably more like we were all just so absorbed with ourselves that we really didn't notice a lot of the embarrassing things that were happening to our peers. And I always like to say that just as an encouragement, right? Because a lot of things go unnoticed by everybody else. Self-centeredness is revealed by the adherence to what some researchers historically have called the personal fable. Others have called it the invincibility fallacy. They technically are kind of different from each other, but I'll just lump them together because I think it's good enough to get the premise. Basically, what the personal fable or the invincibility fallacy tells us is that, bad things happen to other people. Like, they don't happen to me. And so it'll cause teenagers to not take proper precautions if they're going to be sexually active, for example. Or it'll cause them to drink and drive when they know full well, cognitively, they know the dangers of drinking and driving. But this invincibility fallacy kicks in and they go, yeah, well, that's the kind of thing that happens to other people. Or they'll text and drive and they know full well, or they'll live stream and drive and they know full well that these are dangerous things to do. And they've seen, live stream videos of people crashing while they were live streaming, but they tell themselves it won't happen to me because that happens to other people. It's not the kind of thing that would happen to me. That happens to other people. And people carry this along with them pretty much for the rest of their lives, but it's really super powerful in adolescence. And so you see this uptick in risk-taking behavior in adolescence, where as an adult, you're like, how did you not know that that was going to turn out that badly? And the teenager's like, well, I didn't, that's the kind of thing that happens to other people. Why would it happen to me? Right? Like they literally believe that. I knew a girl who got pregnant in 10th grade, and she said, she's crying about it, and she said, this is the kind of thing that happens to other people. Like right there, immediately, like this couldn't happen to me. Like this, why would this happen to me? This happens to other people. And so because of this invincibility fallacy, we see these risk-taking behaviors that this logical, it seems like, mature, it seems like, young person will take these risky behaviors, will take these risks. And one of the things that cognitively is kind of frustrating is that, you can do, driver's ed. And when I was in high school, they had these awful movies that they would play called Red Asphalt. And I don't know how many different ones there were, but whenever the teacher was basically done with the topic and didn't want to start a new one on a Friday, we got to watch the results of car accidents, trying to scare us into driving reasonably. The problem with that logic is that, yeah, it's horrifying. And, I can't believe they were allowed to show it to us, but it doesn't in the moment really have that much impact on the, limbic system driven adolescent brain. The adolescent brain thinks that nothing bad can happen to them because they're them. And the limbic system says, I'm having fun, or this feels good. Nothing bad can happen to me. So let's just go. Let's continue. And so you can end up with some pretty risky behaviors, and then a bunch of adults going, but they just took a test on this and knew full well that they shouldn't be doing this behavior. We just taught this to them. And meanwhile, they're forgetting how powerful the teenage limbic system really is. There was a study where they had students get trained on birth control and the swept away premise and a whole bunch of things. And then they followed those kids to find out how many of them ended up having unprotected sex and or a pregnancy afterwards, and then questioned them about it. And the kids still knew conceptually all the things that they had known prior to getting swept away or having sex without birth control. But in the moment, the limbic system demands were so much more powerful that the logic was lost. It was gone. The prefrontal cortex just wasn't there strongly enough to fight against the limbic system. Indecisiveness is really super common in adolescence. And, it's kind of this is hopefully as you're listening to this, even if you're past 18, you're like, kind of some of these things kind of sound like I might still do some of these things. It's really important to remember that we do these things, throughout our whole lives, but really profoundly while we as an individual are experiencing adolescent development. And so as late as 25 years old, you might still be displaying some of these behaviors. Because the example I'm going to give you about indecisiveness is trying to pick a career. Some of you are completely settled and you're like, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm going to major in. I completely see myself in that career and I am ready to go. And others of you are like, I'm going to do my AA and hope that one of these classes catches my attention and that'll help me to figure out what my future is going to be. And part of why you might be feeling like that is because there's so many possibilities out there. There are so many things that you could do. And so it makes us indecisive. And when we are adolescents, this kind of seeing myself in lots of different possible roles, there's lots of things open to me, makes it very difficult to make a decision. The last thing I wanted to illustrate is a tendency towards hypocrisy where, this finding fault with authorities, I want to criticize, I want to argue, I think I know, and then yet I might do something that's completely contradictory to what I'm stating. Here we have a bunch of people holding up signs. I don't even know who it was about, honestly, but they have hope she chokes. This one in the bottom right says something about GTFO. That doesn't sound very good. Something insult to women. And then in the front it says, Eugene, a hate-free zone. Right? And it's like, these don't all go together. It looks like we're full of hate on the signs, but the people who are holding up the signs that are not being nice are feeling entitled to their opinion, right? They feel like their opinion is correct, and whoever they're insulting with these signs is some authority figure who deserves it, and they're arguing with it, and they're not even aware that they think that they're nice people who, this is a hate-free zone, so you shouldn't be coming here, you hateful person. But you guys are actually the ones expressing the hate, right? Like they don't see it. And so it's really common in adolescent reasoning to have this kind of hypocritical, I'm entitled to my rage, and so I should be allowed to break things or whatever. But somebody else, an authority or whatever, they can't express any kind of frustration or rage or damage or something like that, right? Like it's okay for me, but not for somebody else. That's very characteristic of adolescent egocentrism. All right, well, that's enough on egocentrism. Let's take a break and we'll come back and we'll talk about moral development.